in the League Cup at White Hart Lane. Was involved in a couple of games, then didn't really see the first team, got put back in the reserves. Corridor, someone footsteps down the corridor, jingle jangle of jewellery. I think it's Jimmy Savile. Sort of pap yourself a bit. And she said, I don't know what you've been doing or where you've been, but the manager and the club secretary are downstairs, they want to see you. So I'm sort of panicking a little bit, thinking there's something wrong, and I walk in. I said, son, we've just been driven around Torquay for the last hour and a half in the back of a Jaguar with Alex Ferguson and Archie Knox. They're not leaving Torquay till they shake hand.
I am Brandon, and this is Beyond Football. He's a monster. That's what Lee Sharpe said about one of the players on this list, and you'll understand why. Lee Sharpe was one of the brightest young talents to ever wear a Manchester United shirt. Electric pace, defender's worst nightmare, the kind of winger who could make grown men look silly. But here's the thing about being that good, about being that fast, about having that much flair. You become a target. In the late 80s and 90s, the Premier League was absolutely full of psychopaths. Players whose job wasn't just to stop you, but to make you regret ever stepping onto that pitch. Lee Sharpe recently named 9 footballers who represent pure evil in football. Not evil like robbing a bank, evil in the sporting sense. The kind of ruthless, calculated intimidation that could end your afternoon before half-time. The kind of aggression that made you think twice about asking for the ball. These 9 players terrorised creative footballers for over a decade, and some of them were Sharpe's own teammates at Manchester United. Quick one, if you're watching on Hype, tap Hype and give this video some love, because this list gets nasty fast. Today, we're breaking down all 9 names, from the modern bad boy who couldn't control himself, all the way back to the absolute barbarian who defined an entire era. We're starting at number 9 and working backwards, because the best always comes last. Let's get into it. Before we dive into the names, we need to understand what Lee Sharpe means when he says pure evil. We're not talking about criminals, we're talking about sporting ruthlessness taken to its extreme. In the context of football, especially the football of the late 80s and 90s, evil meant something very specific. Intimidation, mind games, tackles designed not just to win the ball, but to send a message, creating an atmosphere of fear so thick that talented players would hide rather than demand it. For a creative winger like Lee Sharpe, whose game was built on electric pace and unpredictable flair, these players represented existential threats. They weren't just trying to stop him, they were trying to break him. The era Lee Sharpe played in was a battleground between 2 philosophies. On one side, the old-school physical game. Brutal, uncompromising, built on the idea that if you couldn't handle bruises, you had no business being on the pitch. On the other side, the new wave of technical, flashy football. The bright lights and box office stuff the chattering classes loved. Players like Sharpe were caught in the middle of this war. He arrived at Manchester United as part of a generation supposed to bring beauty back to English football. Pace, skill, entertainment. But the defenders waiting for him were from a different world. A world where a welcome tackle in the first 5 minutes set the tone. Where a strategic elbow could send you limping. Where a goalkeeper screaming in your face during training could destroy your confidence for weeks. This is the most underrated part of football history. Everyone remembers the goals, the trophies, the celebrations, but they forget the survival test that creative players faced every week. The 9 players on this list weren't just tough, they were architects of fear. Some used raw violence. Some used psychological warfare. Some were nightmare teammates who made training harder than matches. But they all made life hell for anyone who relied on flair and creativity. For Lee Sharpe, facing these players wasn't occasional. It was every week. It was the price you paid for being brilliant. Number 9. Joey Barton. Right, Joey Barton is a fascinating case because he represents something completely different from everyone else on this list. I've been obsessed with understanding Barton's career for years because it's such a tragic waste of talent. Most of the hard men we're about to discuss had a method to their madness. Their aggressions served a tactical purpose. They intimidated opponents to gain an advantage for their team. They enforced standards to make their clubs better. But Joey Barton? His aggression was chaotic, erratic, often completely counterproductive. Lee Sharpe has participated in multiple retrospectives about Barton, and the theme is always the same: lack of discipline, lack of control. A modern bad boy whose inability to maintain professional standards often hurt his own team more than it hurt the opposition. Barton's career was littered with red cards, suspensions, and incidents that left his managers tearing their hair out. He'd get sent off in crucial matches, he'd pick fights with teammates, he'd lose his head over nothing and leave his side playing with 10 men. The contrast with the older hard men is stark. Players like Vinnie Jones and Stuart Pearce knew exactly what they were doing. Their violence had a job description, but Barton seemed to lack that tactical focus entirely. For creative players facing Barton, the danger wasn't just the tackles or the verbal abuse. It was that you never knew when he'd snap. You could be having a normal match, and then suddenly he'd lose it over something trivial, a bad pass, a perceived slight, nothing, and then you'd be in the middle of a brawl you didn't ask for. What makes Barton's inclusion on this list interesting is that he represents the evolution, or perhaps the devolution, of the bad boy persona. In the 90s, hard men like Jones and Dix were celebrated for their toughness. By the time Barton came along, that same aggression was seen as a liability. The game had moved on. And here's the frustrating part. Barton was talented enough to have a much better career, but his lack of discipline, his inability to channel his aggression productively, made him the rogue on this list, the outlier, the modern bad boy who proved that the old ways don't work anymore. And yet, despite all that, he was still terrifying to play against, because even though his aggression was chaotic, it was real, and creative players had to constantly watch their backs, never knowing when Barton might explode. Number 8. Marco Materazzi. If Joey Barton represents chaotic modern aggression, Marco Materazzi represents something far more sinister: calculated cynicism. And I respect the audacity of it, even if it's absolutely diabolical. Materazzi's evil wasn't about losing control. It was about being in complete control and using that control to manipulate, provoke, and destroy opponents psychologically. Lee Sharpe cites Materazzi for his infamous discipline record and his on-pitch antics, particularly in international competition. And if you know anything about Materazzi, you know exactly what that means. This is the man who provoked Zinedine Zidane into a headbutt in the World Cup final. The biggest match in football, the biggest stage in the world, and Materazzi, cool as anything, whispered something so offensive that one of the greatest players in history lost his mind and ended his career in disgrace. That's not rage, that's dark artistry. Materazzi understood something that a lot of the British hard men on this list didn't fully grasp. In modern football, with cameras everywhere and strict refereeing, physical violence gets you sent off. But psychological violence, that's still legal. You can say things. You can do little things off the ball. You can grab, pinch, tug, whisper, and if your opponent reacts, if they shove you or swing at you, they're the one going off. Materazzi was a master of this. His entire game was built around securing tactical advantages through fouls and provocations. He'd commit a sneaky foul to stop a counterattack. He'd wind up a star player until they snapped. He'd do whatever it took to win, and he didn't care how it looked. For Lee Sharpe, playing against someone like Materazzi would have been a unique kind of nightmare, because you couldn't just worry about the physical battle, you had to stay mentally strong. You couldn't react. You couldn't let him get under your skin, and that's exhausting. It's one thing to deal with someone trying to kick you. It's another thing entirely to deal with someone trying to psychologically dismantle you while making it look like you're the problem. What's particularly interesting about Materazzi is that he represents the globalization of the hard man concept. This wasn't just a British thing anymore. The idea of using intimidation and provocation as a tactical weapon had spread across world football. Materazzi was Italy's version of the enforcer, but with a cynical edge that felt distinctly modern. He proved that you could still be evil in football, even as the game cleaned up its act. You just had to be smarter about it, more calculated, more willing to cross lines that weren't physical but were just as damaging. And that made him one of the most dangerous players of his generation. Number 7. Neil Ruddock, Razor. Now we're getting into the British bad boy culture of the 90s, and Neil Ruddock was right at the heart of it. Look, I'm not going to lie. Watching old Ruddock clips is simultaneously horrifying and hilarious. The man had absolutely zero chill. Lee Sharpe recalls Ruddock for an aggressive style that went way beyond the physical. Ruddock was a player who would try to humiliate you verbally as much as he would physically. The sledging, the trash talk, the constant stream of abuse designed to get inside your head and make you doubt yourself. Ruddock's own list of hardest players highlights his lineage: Dave Mackay, Billy Bonds, absolute legends of uncompromising physicality. Ruddock viewed himself as part of that tradition, an enforcer, someone whose job was to make life miserable for anyone trying to play pretty football. His career at Liverpool and Tottenham was marked by high-profile incidents and a reputation for absolutely smashed challenges. But what made Ruddock different from someone like Julian Dix, who we'll get to later, was the performative quality of his evil. Dix was cold and calculated. Ruddock was boisterous, loud. He wanted you to know he was coming for you. He wanted the crowd to know. He wanted everyone to see that he was the hard man and you were the fancy boy who was about to get taught a lesson. This was the era of the Spice Boys versus the hard men, the cultural conflict between the glamorous new football and the old-school toughness. And Ruddock was a central figure in that narrative. He represented everything the traditionalists loved: no-nonsense defending, physicality, a willingness to do the dirty work. For a winger like Lee Sharpe, facing Ruddock meant dealing with a constant barrage of psychological warfare. He'd be in your ear all match, telling you how soft you were, how you couldn't handle a real challenge, how you were going to spend the afternoon in his pocket. And the frustrating thing was, he could back it up. Ruddock wasn't just talk, he had the physical presence and the defensive ability to make good on his threats. The combination of verbal humiliation and physical dominance made him a nightmare. I've always found the gamesmanship aspect of players like Ruddock fascinating, because it's not just about being tough, it's about understanding psychology. Understanding that if you can make a player feel small, feel inadequate, feel like they don't belong on the same pitch as you, then you've already won half the battle. Ruddock mastered that. His evil had a performative edge that made it almost entertaining for everyone except the poor winger trying to get past him. And that's what made him such a perfect embodiment of the 90s bad boy culture. All attitude, all aggression, all the time. Number 6. Dennis Wise. Now here's where things get really interesting, because Dennis Wise occupies a unique position on this list. Unlike the physically imposing defenders we've been talking about, Wise was a pest. Small, irritating, and absolutely relentless. His evil was subtle. It was in the unseen fouls, the pinches, the little digs and comments that drove creative players absolutely mad. Lee Sharpe needed composure to navigate the tight spaces of the midfield and flank, and Dennis Wise was specifically designed to destroy that composure. Wise was a master of the dark arts. Things the referee couldn't see, things the cameras would miss. A little tug of the shirt, a sneaky elbow in the ribs, a pinch on the back of the leg, a whispered comment about your family. Whatever it took to get a reaction. And the genius of Wise's approach was that it worked. Creative players would lose their heads. They'd shove him, they'd swing at him, and then they'd be the ones getting sent off or booked, while Wise stood there with his hands up, looking innocent. For Chelsea, this was a massive tactical asset. Wise could change the course of a match without throwing a single punch or making a single hard tackle. He'd just wind someone up until they cracked, provoke a moment of madness, and suddenly the opposition's best player was walking off the pitch or playing scared for the rest of the match. I spent 3 hours going down a rabbit hole researching Wise for this video, and what genuinely shocked me was just how consistent this behavior was throughout his entire career. Every club, every season, every single opponent. It wasn't occasional, it wasn't situational. This was his game. Every single match, every single opponent. Constant, relentless psychological warfare designed to make you hate him so much that you'd forget about playing football and start thinking about revenge. And that's when he had you. The inclusion of Wise on this list emphasizes something important. In professional football, evil isn't always about size or strength. Sometimes the most dangerous player is the one who can get inside your head, the pest, the irritant, the one you can't ignore. For a player like Sharpe, who needed mental clarity to make split-second decisions at pace, Wise was a constant source of frustration. You couldn't just focus on your game. You had to focus on not letting this annoying little midfielder ruin your afternoon with his mind games. And, more often than not, he succeeded. Number 5. Stuart Pearce. Psycho. That nickname tells you everything you need to know. Stuart Pearce was genuinely scary. Not in a theatrical way, not in a performative way like Ruddock, genuinely, terrifyingly scary. Lee Sharpe has said that lining up against Pearce felt predatory, like you were prey and he was the hunter. And that intensity, that focus, that absolute commitment to destroying anyone who came near him made Pearce one of the most feared defenders in English football history. Roy Keane, who we'll get to soon, described Pearce as a man among boys at Nottingham Forest. Think about that for a second. Roy Keane, who might be the most intense footballer to ever live, looked at Stuart Pearce and saw someone on another level. That's how scary Pearce was. The physical and mental gulf he created between himself and his peers was extraordinary. But here's what made Pearce different from a lot of the hard men on this list. His aggression was celebrated, not condemned, because it came from obsessive commitment to the game. He wasn't trying to hurt people for the sake of it, he was trying to win. And if that meant booting Ruud Gullit up in the air at training at Newcastle, then that's what he'd do. No reputation was too big, no player was too talented. If you were on the opposite team, or even if you were slacking off in training, Pearce would come through you like a freight train. For a winger like Lee Sharpe, Pearce was the ultimate physical test, because he wasn't just a hard man, he was a highly capable international defender with elite positional sense and timing. He could read the game, he knew when to make the challenge, and when he did, it hurt. Jones was often seen as an ugly exponent of the game, a thug in football boots. But Pearce was viewed as a quintessential British warrior, a hero, someone who embodied everything good about English football: commitment, passion, desire. And yet, for the player on the receiving end of his challenges, the evil was exactly the same. Relentless, focused aggression designed to suppress creative play and make you think twice about asking for the ball. Number 4. Peter Schmeichel. Now this is where Lee Sharpe's list gets really interesting, because Peter Schmeichel wasn't an opponent, he was a teammate. And that's what makes his inclusion so fascinating about the internal psychological pressures of playing at Manchester United in the 90s. Schmeichel wasn't bad in a disciplinary sense. He wasn't going around kicking people or getting red cards, but he was a nightmare teammate. An absolute nightmare. Why? Because of his aggressive shouting and his unrelenting demands. And if you made a mistake, if you switched off for even a second, you'd hear about it, loud, in front of everyone. There's a story that perfectly captures Schmeichel's intensity. Tony Adams, Arsenal legend, absolute titan of English football, described an encounter with Schmeichel at Sheffield. Adams said it felt like Schmeichel was looking straight through him, asking, "Who are you?" Not in a joking way, in a genuinely intimidating, "you don't belong here" way. If that's how he made Tony Adams feel, imagine how he made a young winger feel during a difficult period. For Lee Sharpe, who faced injury issues and periods of insecurity during his United career, Schmeichel's intensity must have been crushing. Because Schmeichel's standards were impossibly high, his confident handling, his command of the area, his expectation that everyone in front of him would be perfect every single time. That's a lot of pressure, and if you couldn't handle it, if the fear of being screamed at affected your performance, then you are creating a vicious cycle. Poor performance leads to getting shouted at, which leads to more insecurity, which leads to worse performance. The psychological toll was real. And yet, from a tactical perspective, Schmeichel's aggression worked. By instilling fear in his defenders, he kept them hyper-vigilant. They didn't switch off. They didn't take plays off. They knew that if they did, they'd face the wrath of the best goalkeeper in the world. But as Tony Adams noted, this environment could make you feel like you were playing with absolute nutters. It suppressed your ability to express yourself freely. For creative players who needed a degree of psychological freedom to thrive, that was a disaster. The inclusion of Schmeichel on this list is perhaps the most insightful aspect of Lee Sharpe's classification. Number 3. Roy Keane. If Peter Schmeichel was a nightmare teammate because of his vocal demands, Roy Keane was a nightmare teammate because of his enforcement of standards through sheer psychological terror. Lee Sharpe's inclusion of Keane on this list provides a window into just how intense the Manchester United dressing room became in the mid to late 90s. And for a flair player like Sharpe, that intensity was absolutely suffocating. Keane's leadership was built on a simple principle: no mediocrity, no excuses, no second chances, ever. His autobiography details a simmering rage and a perceived lack of ambition in others that led to a constant buzz of high-pressure demands. When Keane arrived at United as a 22-year-old, he was initially amazed by the charisma of senior figures like Schmeichel and Brian McClair. These were legends, established stars, but Keane quickly realized that charisma alone wasn't enough. The club needed an enforcer, someone who would hold everyone accountable, someone who would make sure that the standards never dropped, not even for a second. And Keane appointed himself to that role. He became the judge, jury, and executioner of the United dressing room. For Lee Sharpe, the fear Keane inspired wasn't physical. It was the fear of verbal and professional evisceration, of being called out in front of everyone, of being deemed not good enough, not committed enough, not United material. And once Keane decided you were a problem, there was absolutely no coming back from that verdict. You were finished. Your United career was over. The Saipan incident in 2002 is the ultimate expression of Keane's uncompromising nature. He got himself banished from the Irish World Cup squad because he refused to accept substandard preparation. Think about that for a moment. The World Cup, the biggest tournament in football, the pinnacle of any player's career, and Keane walked away from it because the training facilities weren't good enough, because the professionalism wasn't up to his standards. That's the level of rage we're talking about. That's the level of standards. And if you were a Manchester United player who wasn't meeting those standards, you felt that rage directed at you every single day. The fascinating thing about Keane's evil is that it was essential for United's success. The psychologically robust club that Ferguson built was a direct result of Keane's enforcement. He made United winners. He made them mentally tough. But the cost was real. For players who needed a bit of freedom, a bit of encouragement, a bit of psychological space to express themselves, Keane's presence was a nightmare. Number 2. Julian Dicks, the Terminator. If you wanted one name that perfectly encapsulates cold-blooded defensive aggression, it's Julian Dicks. And yes, I know what you're thinking about the name Julian Dicks, but trust me, the nickname The Terminator is somehow even more fitting. Lee Sharpe faced him on the flank, and by all accounts, Dicks was one of the most physically intimidating defenders in Premier League history. His reputation at West Ham and Liverpool was built on a simple philosophy: no winger settles into a match. No winger gets comfortable. No winger has a good afternoon. Not on my watch. Not ever. What made Dicks so genuinely terrifying was the premeditated nature of his violence. This wasn't heat-of-the-moment stuff. This wasn't a player losing his head in a crucial moment and making a rash challenge. This was calculated, professional, ruthless, cold-blooded in the truest sense of the term. There's a quote that captures this perfectly. Dicks talking about an elbow he gave Franz Carr. "I had it in mind that I was going to do it, and that was it. Bang." Think about that for a second. Read that again. He decided before the match even started that he was going to hurt someone. He made a conscious decision. He planned it out. And then he executed it without a shred of hesitation or remorse. Just pure, systematic execution. That's why they called him the Terminator. Because he was systematic. Methodical. Emotionless. His job was to neutralize threats, and he approached that job with the cold efficiency of a machine programmed for one purpose: destroy creative wingers. The nickname wasn't just a playful moniker given to him by fans. It reflected his entire approach to defending, his entire philosophy. Stop anything the opposition could throw at him, by any means necessary. If that meant ending a winger's afternoon prematurely with a strategic elbow, or a brutal challenge that left them limping, then so be it. That was the job. That was what he was paid to do. And Dicks never questioned it. The tactical utility of Dicks in the 4-4-2 systems of the 90s was massive. By dominating the touchline, he forced wingers like Sharpe to move centrally into what Michael Cox calls the sewer of the midfield. And once you were in there, surrounded by the kind of hairy defenders that Ferguson complained about, your effectiveness dropped dramatically. You couldn't use your pace. You couldn't isolate your man. You were just another body in a crowded physical battleground. For Sharpe, facing Dicks meant making a choice. Do I try to take him on and risk serious injury? Or do I drift inside and accept that my game is compromised? Neither option was good. And that's exactly what Dicks wanted. He wanted you scared. That's evil. Pure, cold-blooded evil. Number 1. Vinnie Jones, the barbarian. The definitive archetype of the 90s hardman. The player who defined an entire era of intimidation and violence. If you're going to have one name as the face of football's evil, it has to be Vinnie Jones. Lee Sharpe frequently talks about the welcome Jones provided in early games, and that's the perfect euphemism for what Jones actually did. High-intensity, often illegal challenges designed to induce a state of psychological retreat in young players. Make them scared, make them tentative, make them wish they'd stayed home. Jones wasn't just a player, he was a weapon, a tactical tool deployed by Wimbledon's crazy gang to disrupt the rhythm of technical teams like Manchester United. And it worked brilliantly. Wimbledon's entire survival in the top flight was predicated on this philosophy. They couldn't outplay the big clubs technically, so they had to break them mentally and physically. It was systemic. It was planned. It was Wimbledon's identity. And Jones was the absolute perfect embodiment of that identity. Raw, unfiltered, terrifying. The crazy gang weren't just physical, they were psychologically disruptive. They'd do things in the tunnel before matches. They'd engage in antics designed to unsettle opponents before a ball was even kicked. And once the whistle blew, Jones would make his presence felt immediately. That welcome tackle wasn't just about winning the ball, it was about establishing dominance, about making you understand that this wasn't going to be a comfortable 90 minutes. This was going to be war. The most famous example of Jones's intimidation tactics is his interaction with Paul Gascoigne in 1990. The handful of Gaz's testicles, captured on camera, broadcast to the nation. A physical provocation so outrageous, so brazen, that it became iconic. That was Jones in a nutshell. He didn't just want to beat you, he wanted to humiliate you, destabilize you, make you lose your focus and your composure. For a young Lee Sharpe, arriving in an era of bright lights and box office, Jones represented the bad old days of muck and violence that the chattering classes hated. He was everything the new Premier League was supposed to move away from. Brutal, primitive, uncompromising. And yet, he was also wildly effective. The cultural fallout of Jones reached its peak in 1992 with the release of Soccer's Hardmen. Jones presented this video in his undergarments, and it led to a full-blown moral panic. I actually tracked down a copy of this video a few years back, and honestly, it's wild. Headlines screaming about a video nasty, soccer's shame. The Football Association condemned Jones's vile observations and his advocacy for deliberately crippling opponents. It was a watershed moment. The league was trying to rebrand itself as the beautiful game, and here was Vinnie Jones, on video, basically admitting that his job was to hurt people. The paradox is that while the media and the authorities decried Jones, the public remained absolutely fascinated by him. He became a commercially viable brand. The hardman persona made him famous. It got him movie roles. It made him a celebrity. And decades later, it's what allows Lee Sharpe to name him on lists like this. Because Jones represents something that's been largely regulated out of modern football. A raw, visceral era where physical intimidation was not just accepted, but celebrated in certain circles. For Sharpe, Jones was the ultimate test, not just because of the physical threat, but because of what Jones represented, the collision of two footballing philosophies, the old-school enforcers versus the new wave of flair players. Jones was the barbarian at the gates of the beautiful game, and he nearly knocked those gates down. So there you have it, 9 different archetypes of evil, from Joey Barton's chaotic modern aggression all the way back to Vinnie Jones's primitive intimidation. But here's what ties them all together. For a winger like Lee Sharpe, this wasn't theoretical, this was his life. Every single week, every single match, an absolute survival test. The tactical consequences of these players were profound and far-reaching. Opposition managers specifically deployed hardmen like Jones, Dix and Pearce as stoppers. Their job was simple: shut down United's pace and power on the wings, provoke the flair players, make them crack under physical pressure. And if that meant a few yellow cards or a few injuries, so be it. That was the price of stopping teams like Manchester United from running riot. Think about what that meant for tactical planning. Managers would literally select players based on their ability to intimidate, to physically dominate, to psychologically undermine. It wasn't just about football ability, it was about who could win the mental battle, who could make the opposition's star player hide. The battle between the winger and the hard-man fullback was the defining tactical struggle of the 90s, and it shaped absolutely everything about how the game was played. It shaped how teams defended, it shaped how attackers had to adapt their movement and positioning, it shaped the very culture of the league itself. The hairy defenders were specifically tasked with provoking technical players, and more often than not, it worked. Creative players would lose their heads, they'd get frustrated, they'd retaliate and get sent off. Or they'd just disappear from matches, too scared to demand the ball. But when it didn't work, when a player like Sharpe managed to navigate through these physical barriers and maintain his composure, the results were absolutely magical. His backheel goal against Barcelona in '94 wasn't just skillful, it was a statement. It was proof that beauty could triumph over brutality if you were brave enough and good enough. The electric pace that left defenders for dead, those moments only happened because players like Sharpe refused to be intimidated. They took the hits, they endured the constant abuse, both physical and verbal. They faced down the barbarians and the executioners, and the tyrants, match after match, season after season, and they still found a way to create magic. That's what made that era so special. The contrast, the tension, the knowledge that every moment of brilliance was hard-earned. As football transitioned into the 2000s, the game evolved. Stricter discipline, more cards, the introduction of VAR. The nightmare of dealing with physical intimidation was gradually replaced by more structured, tactical pressure. But the legacy remains, and this is why I find this era so captivating. These 9 players shaped an entire generation of footballers. They defined what it meant to be tough, what it meant to survive, what it meant to earn your place on the pitch. And that brings us to the positive resolution, because despite all the evil, despite all the intimidation and the fear and the brutality, football moved forward. The game evolved into something more beautiful, more technical, more fair. But the stories of these 9 players still matter. They matter because they show what it took to survive in that era. They show the resilience required to create magic in the face of absolute chaos. For Lee Sharpe, naming these 9 footballers isn't about holding grudges. It's about acknowledging a reality that shaped his career and the careers of countless creative players. These men were evil in the sporting sense, but they were also part of what made that era of football so compelling. The tension between beauty and brutality, between flair and fear. That tension created some of the most memorable moments in Premier League history, and every goal scored, every trick played, every moment of brilliance was earned in the face of the most intimidating personalities the game has ever seen. The beautiful game survived the barbarians, and it's better for it. If you enjoyed this deep dive into football's hardest men, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe for more football history content, and drop a comment telling me which of these 9 players you think was the most evil. Was it Jones with his raw intimidation, Keane with his psychological terror, or someone else entirely? Let me know. I'll see you in the next one.